As the days passed, the house began to show its true colors. Caroline, now settled into her routine of researching the mysterious family that had once owned the house, began to feel the weight of the place more keenly. The air grew thicker, as if imbued with memories of suffering and dread. The haunting was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like a fleeting chill on the back of her neck or the sound of distant footsteps in a house that should have been empty. The haunting began with whispers, indistinct at first, like the soft murmur of wind through the trees. But they grew louder. At night, as Caroline lay in bed, the whispers became conversations, disjointed fragments of voices from another time. They murmured about betrayal, about dark rituals, and something called the key. She couldn't make sense of it, but the voices filled her dreams, transforming them into vivid nightmares. One night, she woke up gasping, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was cold, the air around her thick with tension. She could feel eyes on her, though no one was there. She knew it was the house. Its dark history was beginning to unravel, and it had chosen her as its vessel. The shadows came next. At first, they were just out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting figure, a distortion of light, but they grew more persistent. Caroline would walk into a room and feel as though someone had just left, the air still charged with their presence. In the kitchen, she swore she saw a shadow dart across the hallway, but when she chased after it, there was nothing. One evening, as she was working late into the night, researching the old families tied to the house, she caught sight of a shadow in the reflection of her laptop screen. The shadow stood still, unmoving, right behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, but nothing was there. Yet she knew she wasn't alone. Sleep was no longer a refuge for Caroline. Her dreams were filled with grotesque images, a woman, pale and gaunt, holding a key forged from bone. She stood in a circle of hooded figures, chanting words that Caroline didn't understand but filled her with dread. The woman's eyes were hollow, as though her soul had been drained long ago. The dreams bled into reality. During the day, Caroline began to experience visions. She would be walking through the house, and suddenly, she wasn't in the present anymore. The wallpaper was different, the furniture antique and unfamiliar. She would see the same woman from her dreams, staring at her with hollow eyes, as though trapped in time. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, she found a mirror that didn't reflect her own image. Instead, it showed the room as it had been centuries ago. She saw the woman again, sitting in a chair, holding the skeleton key in her hands. Their eyes met through the reflection, and the woman smiled, a cold, empty grin that chilled Caroline to her core. Determined to uncover the truth, Caroline dug deeper into the house's history. She found newspaper clippings and old letters in the library that spoke of a mysterious death in the house, a woman named Margaret Devereaux. Margaret had been the last living heir of the Devereaux family, and her death had been ruled a suicide, but whispers in the town suggested something far more sinister. It was said that Margaret had been involved in the occult, practicing dark rituals in secret. She had been searching for something, the key, the article said, believing it would unlock the secrets of immortality. But instead, she had unlocked something else, something dark and ancient that had cursed the house and its inhabitants. Caroline knew now that she was dealing with something far more dangerous than just a ghost. The house was alive with malevolent energy, and it wanted something from her. But what? The answer lay in the key, Margaret's key, but finding it meant facing the full force of the haunting. The sensation of being watched never left her. No matter where she was in the house, she could feel it, eyes following her every move, lingering just out of sight. One night, she heard a soft tapping sound coming from the walls. She pressed her ear to the wall, and for a moment, she thought she heard breathing, slow, deliberate, and right behind the plaster. The sound of scratching soon followed. It grew louder and more frantic with each passing night. Caroline couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The house was unraveling her mind, piece by piece. And then, one night, she heard the whisper again, this time louder than ever before. It came from directly behind her. "Find the key," it hissed. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the shadow lingering in the corner, watching her. Caroline knew she couldn't ignore the haunting any longer. The house was pulling her deeper into its web, and if she didn't confront it, she feared she would lose herself entirely. Armed with the fragmented knowledge she had uncovered about the Devereaux family and their connection to the skeleton key, Caroline prepared herself for the final confrontation. Late one night, she descended into the basement, the heart of the haunting. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, and the walls seemed to close in on her as she ventured deeper into the darkness. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, echoing off the stone walls. In the center of the room, she saw it, an old chest, bound with rusted iron. Her heart raced as she approached it. She knew, instinctively, that the key was inside. But as she reached for the chest, the shadows began to move. They swirled around her, taking shape, becoming the figures from her dreams. The woman, Margaret, stepped forward, her hollow eyes fixed on Caroline. She reached out, her bony hand grasping for the key. Caroline knew what she had to do. She had to unlock the chest. But as her fingers touched the cold metal of the keyhole, the room erupted into chaos. The shadows screamed, the walls trembled, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to vanish. The house wasn't going to let her go without a fight. This chapter marks the turning point in Caroline's journey as she uncovers the house's dark history and realizes that the haunting is far more personal than she ever imagined. The buildup of tension through whispers, shadows, and nightmarish visions creates a pervasive sense of dread, setting the stage for the climactic showdown in the following chapters. The house was never truly silent. Not anymore. At first, Caroline convinced herself that the whispering was the wind, weaving through the cracks in the old walls, but as the days stretched on, she knew that was a lie. The sounds came in the stillest moments, deep in the heart of the night. They were soft, too soft to make out clearly, but insistent enough to disrupt her sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, willing her mind to find reason in the unreasonable. The whispers were coming from the hallway, near the door of her bedroom. She strained to listen, but they were muffled, as if spoken just beyond her reach. "Leave," a voice breathed faintly one night. Caroline's blood ran cold. Another night, she heard a different voice, one tinged with fear. "The key," it whispered. "Find the key." That night, her dream was vivid. She stood in the same hallway, the house bathed in cold moonlight. The walls seemed to pulse, and from the shadows came a figure, draped in black. It didn't move but only stood there, watching her with eyes she couldn't see. The figure pointed down the hall, toward a door she had never noticed before. The figure spoke, its voice cold and low, "She waits for you." The next day, Caroline couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She walked through the house in a daze, her skin prickling whenever she passed certain rooms or stood too long in a shadowed corner. It was as if the house had come alive with secrets, each darkened corner hiding a presence that shouldn't be there. By afternoon, she had decided to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. But when she stepped out into the sunlight, it felt unnatural, too bright, too far removed from the dim, ancient corridors inside. She turned back to the house, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a shadow move across the upstairs window, her bedroom window. She stared at it, frozen. The room should have been empty. That night, the shadows became more than mere fleeting glimpses. As Caroline sat at the kitchen table, poring over old documents she had found in the attic, the feeling of eyes on her intensified. She glanced up from the yellowed papers and caught a dark shape in the corner of her vision, near the doorway to the living room. Her heart hammered in her chest as the shadow flickered, becoming solid for just a second before vanishing into thin air. Caroline's breath hitched, and her hand shook as she held the document tighter. She stood up, determined to confront whatever it was, but as she approached the living room, the cold air hit her like a wall. The room was empty, but the shadow, it lingered. She could feel it watching her, hidden just beyond the edge of her sight. Sleep offered no solace. Every time Caroline drifted off, the dreams returned, pulling her deeper into the twisted history of the house. In these dreams, the house was not the one she knew. It was older, darker, and filled with the presence of people long dead. In the most disturbing of these visions, she found herself standing in a grand dining room, lit by candlelight. The woman was there again, the same gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in tattered silk, her hand gripping the bone key. The air in the room crackled with tension as hooded figures surrounded her, chanting in a language Caroline couldn't understand. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Caroline was frozen in place. The woman stepped forward, her lips parting to speak, but before the words could form, her face twisted into a scream, her body convulsing as the hooded figures closed in. Caroline jerked awake, her body drenched in sweat. She could still hear the woman's scream echoing in her mind, and worse, she could feel the key, cold and heavy, as though it had been placed in her hand. Her fingers clenched, and she half expected to find the key there when she opened her eyes. Determined not to let the house break her, Caroline spent hours in the library, poring over any records she could find. She uncovered old newspapers detailing the death of Margaret Devereaux, the last known resident of the house. The official story was that she had taken her own life, but the circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious. According to local lore, Margaret had been obsessed with the occult, convinced that she had found a way to transcend death using an artifact called the skeleton key. It was said that she believed the key could open a door to immortality, but in her desperation, she had unleashed something far more dangerous, something that had claimed her life. Caroline sat back, her fingers trembling as she turned over the brittle paper in her hands. There were no records of what had happened to the key after Margaret's death, but whispers in the town spoke of strange occurrences, as if the house itself had become a prison for whatever Margaret had awakened. And now, Caroline realized with dawning horror, the house had chosen her. As the days passed, the strange occurrences intensified. Caroline could hear sounds coming from the walls, scratching, soft at first, but growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. Sometimes, she thought she heard whispers behind the plaster, faint and garbled, but always there, lurking. One night, the sound was particularly loud. She pressed her ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint its source. For a moment, there was silence, and then, she heard it, a slow, deliberate breathing. The sound was so close, it felt as though the wall itself were alive, pulsing with some malevolent force just beyond her reach. Terrified, she stepped back, but the breathing continued, following her down the hall. She rushed to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, but even then, the feeling of being watched never left. The air in the room was thick with a presence she could not see but could feel, always there, lurking just out of sight. Caroline knew the house wanted something from her. It was no longer content with tormenting her with shadows and whispers. It wanted her to find the key, to finish what Margaret had started all those years ago. Armed with the fragmented knowledge she had gathered, Caroline decided to face the heart of the haunting. She descended into the basement, the darkest part of the house, where the air was thick with rot and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. In the center of the room stood an old chest, its iron locks rusted with age. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she approached it, the whispering voices growing louder, echoing in her mind. She knew the key was inside, but as her fingers reached for the lock, the shadows around her began to writhe. They rose from the ground like tendrils of smoke, twisting and coiling, taking shape. Margaret appeared before her, her hollow eyes fixed on Caroline, her bony hand reaching out. The house was alive with fury, and it was not going to let her leave.